So the title of this event, as many of you are aware, is Civil Disobedience Now. So our speakers are going to say some interesting things, I'm sure. But I would say that primarily this event is a call to action. And not later, now. We're living in a world on an insane trajectory. It's been 30 years or more, really more, that scientists have been warning us that without drastic changes, global heating will destroy life on this planet as we know it. But their warnings have been completely ignored, and instead, we just continue on with business as usual, greenhouse gases increasing exponentially. It's like we're on a train hurtling toward a cliff, but all our leaders will talk about is how important this train journey is. And the cliff is now in sight. The time to save ourselves from unthinkable annihilation is incomprehensibly short. Politics, as usual, has failed us. Even if currently proposed solutions like the new Green Deal get adopted, which is not that likely, they will be too little and too slow. So our speakers today, Chris Hedges, Clare Farrell, Kumi Naidoo, and Roger Hallam have been on the front lines in the last few years, calling for people to wake up to the severity of the emergency we're in, the urgency, and to do what is necessary to save ourselves and all life on this planet. So they will each address the topic of civil disobedience now for like 7 or 8 minutes. And I will give a short intro to each speaker before they speak and kind of do the transitions in between. And while they're speaking, please feel free to submit the questions in the chat to the questions. There's several of us listed on there as co-hosts, but you want to make sure that it's you send them to questions, XRA questions #1. And we will save them up and sort them, and then there'll be a Q&A period later. So right after the speakers, there will be a very short call to action. The time for listening and to inspiring speeches and thinking about how theoretically this should happen is over. So if you need any help, finding a way to take action, there are lots of people on this call ready to help you out with that. Find something meaningful to do. So after the brief call to action, then there will be a Q&A session where we will have taken the questions from you, and we will be posing them to the different speakers. So when you submit a question, if you want to address it to one particular speaker, please note that in the question. And the Q&A session, we're not sure exactly how that will last, how long that will be, but it will last until we've gone a total of 90 minutes. And then the last 30 minutes of this event, even if it's not on the official schedule, is perhaps the most important of all. It's your opportunity to translate attending, especially for those of you in North America, your opportunity to translate your attendance today into doing something, if you aren't already doing something. So we will be getting more specific about how you can get involved in movement building nonviolent civil disobedience and in preparing for the mass uprising required to save us from extinction. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker, which will be Chris Hedges. We are delighted to have him here today. And Chris is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, a Presbyterian minister, author and television host. He's led a rich and active life, including decades spent as a foreign correspondent, reporting from over 50 countries. His most recent books include Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt, sounds right up our alley, and America, the Farewell Tour. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
there. Am I unmuted? Sorry.
Yeah.
So I think all of this is predicated on the systems of power, whether they are reformable and whether they can address what is the greatest existential crisis to face the human species and most other species on the planet over the last, let's say, 10,000 years or something. My analysis in numerous books and articles that I have written is no, that my understanding of power is grounded in the work of several political scientists and philosophers, in particular Sheldon Wolin, who died a few years ago, probably was our greatest contemporary political philosopher, wrote that great work, Power and Vision, and then his last book, Democracy Incorporated, where he talks about the system of corporate or corporate totalitarianism or corporate control as inverted totalitarianism. And that's very much like the end of the Roman Republic, where you still have the facade of democratic institutions along with the iconography and language of the state. Under the emperors, starting with Augustus going forward, there was still a Senate in the same way that there still is a Congress, there still is electoral politics, there still is a constitution, although our courts have removed most of our constitutional rights by judicial fiat, by reinterpreting the Constitution to serve corporate power. There are numerous examples of that: the evisceration of the right to privacy, the allowance of corporate money, dark money, to flood the electoral system and control it, the Supreme Court in Citizens United ruling that that was the right to petition the government in a form of free speech. So that we've seized up, the system has seized up. Legislation is written by lobbyists. And that, of course, led to the rise of a figure like Trump. Trump was the symptom, not the disease, the reconfiguration of wealth, unlike anything we've seen in American history, but this has been repeated in Britain and around most of the world by this global oligarchic elite. And I think we have to put it in perspective. It's unlike, for instance, if you go back to the old robber baron era in the United States, figures like Carnegie, Mellon, Rockefeller. When Rockefeller died, he was worth about $3 billion. Even the worst despots around the world, Melda Marcos and Ferdinand Marcos, looted anywhere between 5 and 10 billion. Mugabe stole about $1 billion. But Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk each are worth 180 billion. This is a concentration of wealth that we've never seen. And when that cabal seizes power and it disenfranchises larger and larger segments of the population, then in Hannah Arendt, you can go back and read Hannah Arendt's book on violence, then this dispossession, disenfranchisement is expressed through violence. It's also expressed through what anthropologists call crisis cults. For me, that's the Christian right. I'm a seminary graduate. I am actually an ordained Presbyterian minister. I grew up in the church. My father was a minister. So I come out of that tradition. But the Christian right is a kind of modern replication of the so-called German Christian church, which was pro-Nazi in the 1930s, with a swastika being on one side of the pulpit and the Christian cross on another. It's a heretical belief system that serves the interests of corporate power by preying on those in deep distress and despair. And I wrote a book on the Christian right about a decade ago called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I did not use the term fascist lightly. In fact, when I finished the 2 years of research on the book, I sat down with Fritz Stern, the great scholar on fascism at Columbia University, who fled Nazi Germany as a teenager, as well as Robert Paxton, who wrote Anatomy of Fascism, to see if these two great scholars of fascism could, in essence, argue me out of using that title. And I went with it. And so the system itself has And I think one of the attributes of the Christian right, and we saw the connecting tissue on January 6th when that mob invaded the Congress, that connecting tissue was Christian nationalism, Christian extremism, Christian fascism, and it functions as what they call crisis cults. Anthropologists call crisis cults. 1890, the decimation of Native Americans ends with a ghost dance. That's a classic example of a crisis cult, but so is the Christian right. It's magical thinking. And you have seen, as you did in late Weimar, this marriage between the most retrograde forces of capitalism and this crisis cult. And as Hannah Arendt writes, all totalitarian belief systems embrace magical thinking, the fascism or Stalinism or anything else. So what's happened is that as the country has seized up and the institution no longer work, we're watching the rise of this virulent proto-fascist movement, which is hardly limited. I'm just checking my timer so don't go over my time. Hardly limited to the United States, and the forces of public relations and propaganda. MSNBC, these are all corporate controlled entities, CNN and everything else, have a vested interest in keeping people invested in this dysfunctional system, marginalizing critics of global capitalism, inverted totalitarianism, whatever you want to call it, to keep people passive. And it's been quite effective. The voices, powerful voices, I mean, America's most important intellectual, Noam Chomsky, is virtually blacklisted, even from public television and public radio. One of the largest donors is the Koch brothers and the Koch Foundation. So I think at least my job as a writer has been to try and shine a lens into the inner workings, into the machinery of power, expose it for what it is. And once it is exposed, once we understand how power works, and there are powerful forces that work very hard to cover up that reality of power, then we are left with no option but mass civil disobedience, because these forces are not reformable from within. We saw that in 2016 with the Sanders campaign, and we saw it again in the 2020 presidential election when the powerful interests of the Democratic Party conspired to stop Sanders. Not that Sanders was a particularly radical candidate on the political spectrum, but stop him from taking power. And indeed, the largest donors of the Democratic Party, Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, were very public that if somehow Sanders got the nomination, they would vote for Trump. So they anointed Joe Biden in the same way that the aristocrats and power lead in 1932 anointed von Papen. They all were terrified of the Nazis, to kind of recreate the ancien regime, this conservative utopianism that is very much Biden's role, as it was with von Papen's, but it's going to blow up in their face. In the same way that it did in Weimar. And we have very little time left, and Roger and others can speak to this better than I can, but if there's one constant among climate scientists, it's that things are unraveling or deteriorating at a far faster rate than any of them predicted. So massive, nonviolent civil disobedience, with the goal being to overthrow corporate power, because corporate power itself has us in essence on a death march, and that death march is bringing us closer and closer to the annihilation of most all living beings on the planet. And let me just throw a plug in for veganism. I'm a vegan, and I became a vegan for environmental reasons, because it's one thing we can wake up and do tomorrow. The animal agriculture industry is, along with the fossil fuel industry, one of the major contributors to global warming. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. I would love to listen to each one of these speakers much longer. So, but let's move on. So next up is Clare Farrell. So one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion. who's been instrumental in the team behind the movement's name and identity and imaging and messaging. So some of them were creative aspects, and Claire has a background in the fashion industry and has been educating on fashion, ethics, and sustainability for over a decade. And she remains active in the fight to address the climate and ecological emergency. So with that, Claire, all to you.
Okay, has it worked? Sorry, that was a bit difficult. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for that, Chris. No pressure. Really don't want to follow Chris Hedges ever talking. Well, the first thing I'll say is that I got asked for a quote for this, and I can't remember precise words, but I said something like, the reason we should all do civil disobedience now is because humanity is completely fucked, and there's no other good purpose for your life than to peacefully resist the state corporate planned mass murder that we're in the midst of. And that's it, really, isn't it? I think one of the things that I want to talk about is how kind of I see it as a cultural kind of time that we're in, where first of all it's kind of creative and spiritual and an educational process to work in this way, I think, on a kind of form of embodied resistance. And we have to bear in mind that people are going to become increasingly desperate. And as Chris has just said, things are constantly referenced to be going much quicker than we ever expected. Children in the UK have been risking their lives. They've been on hunger strike over coal mines. They've been down tunnels, protesting against new, very, very destructive projects. So say our friends at the HS2 rebellion, tunnels are the tactic of the desperate. So we're already reaching these points where the most concerned citizens are feeling quite desperate. But we know that when things become more widespread in that way, that a non-violent worldwide movement is going to be a very welcome predecessor to the times that we have ahead. I'm also interested at the moment in our movements that there are various conversations going on around non-violence, and I wanted to sort of say a few things about what I see as important in non-violence, which is that it's not passive and it's not the same as pacifism, that it's proactive, that it is leaderful, and that it takes courage, because the systems that we're trying to overturn, rewire, redesign, or whatever are just design systems, and they could easily be designed differently or made differently, as my friend David Graeber famously said. And I think there are very few options available to good people who want to see a potential for the sustaining of life on Earth. And I, at the moment, quite often feel like I'm in a sci-fi movie or something when I'm talking about this stuff, because it still feels like if you're talking about potential collapse, if you're talking about the reality of the worst case scenarios and how they seem to be rushing ever and ever closer to us, I hear the older generation speaking out in desperate fear, actually, for the future that they've prepared for the younger generations. And this future has been inevitably created, I think, by the assault on reason and science and collective power, the assault on our sense of community, certainly in the UK, and the dismantling of people's conception of the fact that there is a possibility for change. And I think neoliberalism wants us to feel precarious and isolated and powerless, and I feel when I meet a lot of people that we're in an epidemic of powerlessness along with COVID, and it's made it much worse, that people feel so alone. And we really need masses and masses of people to come together as the kind of antidote to this. And so I guess, you know, we're living in this kind of extreme social context where I feel the world I've been brought up in, you know, compassion is often seen as a weakness. Generosity is the way to lose the main game. Responsibility is a corporate matter. State murder has been normalized. The British Medical Journal has just described the British political situation as social murder. And where I think some people would rather their kids grew up to be rich than to be kind. And our systems are very fragile, and we know that we're not ready, and we're totally unprepared for something that we've been expecting for decades. And we feel vulnerable because we are, but in Extinction Rebellion, we've tried to go out there and say that we're brave enough to show our vulnerability. Because we know that we're heading into this future. People are saying there's like the new normal. And other people have said to me, there's no normal. It's a future now of no normal. And so we've reached, I guess, for the virtue of being disobedient in the face of this. And I guess another thing that I think is really important about the work we do is facilitation skills and being able to hold spaces and talk to people, good communication. And it's a really important part of doing nonviolent work, is to be a good communicator and to reach across divides, across cultural divides and differences and generational differences and the patriarchy and ageism, ableism, racism, classism. There's all these lines along which we're all divided and ruled. And it seems like this is the way that the status quo keeps itself going. And so we've got to continue to work towards collective action. And Extinction Rebellion was born on a kind of social model of power. So the idea that you remove your consent by saying no, and you can call this work, nonviolent direct action, you can call it peaceful civil disobedience, you can call it refusal, non-cooperation, resistance, rejection. There are many, many names for it, but I think the main thing that I want to close by saying is just that we know that we need to work collaboratively and peacefully and proactively, and to empower people in compassion and in the name of liberation, and in the demand for a world where we aim to base everything around care and freedom as our sort of primary principles. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire, so much. All right, so our next speaker is Kumi Naidoo, who has been an activist his entire life, starting out fighting apartheid in South Africa as a child in the 70s and 80s. Among his many activities, he served as the International Executive Director of Greenpeace from 2009 to 2016, and the Secretary General of Amnesty International from 2018 through 2020. So he's also been active with African Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kumi.
Thank you, Domo, and greetings, everybody, and thank you for making time for this important conversation. Following Claire and Chris, I'm reminded of a moment during the South African liberation struggle. By the way, greetings from South Africa. I'm talking to you quite late in the evening from here, where if you follow two presentations like the one that you just heard from Claire and Chris, you started by saying, most of the really good points I wanted to make have been eloquently made by the previous speaker. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for about 2 hours. Given that I have very few minutes, let me get to the point. The first point is why civil disobedience critically is necessary now. And that is because humanity has entered the most consequential decade in the history of humanity. What we do in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future, or whether we will have a future at all. We are still in a situation where there is massive cognitive dissonance and denial about the fact that we are right on the climate cliff, and we are literally 2 minutes to midnight, and still what we have from those in power, whether it's corporate power or political power, is largely baby steps in the right direction, incremental tinkering here and there, when in fact, given how long they've dragged the feet, how long the science was falsified by the fossil fuel industry and others and so on, this is a catch-up time, right? That's the first point. The second is, why do we need civil disobedience? If history teaches us anything, whenever humanity has faced a major injustice or a major challenge, those struggles only moved forward when decent people stood up and said, enough is enough. We are prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to put our lives on the line if necessary. And I want to suggest that the climate challenge, the climate danger, the climate catastrophe we are facing is, in a sense, more important a challenge than all the other struggles combined. Because what we are talking about here is whether we'll even be able to live to fight another day to ensure that we get gender equality. What we are talking about here is whether we will be able to live to ensure that we get a world of greater economic equity, for example. But it is critically important that we recognize that civil disobedience has played a critically important role, and that where we are today, we need to be very strategic in how we think about civil disobedience. Firstly, we need to recognize that civil disobedience is contextual. What works well in one place does not necessarily work well in another place. So for example, I'm not sure whether everybody on the call is familiar with mooning, you know, where you pull your pants down and show your backside and you can write a slogan like "Stop the Extinction" and so on. Now that might work well in maybe US or Europe. It might not work so well in Saudi Arabia or in, say, Indonesia. Okay, so understanding that, especially in a global movement, for us to be able to be very strategic, to understand that civil disobedience is communicating to multiple constituencies. I would argue that often civil disobedience is communicating to our people, to ensure that our people can see our outrage and identify with that outrage. But we have to project what we are doing in a way that brings people closer to us. I have been working with a lot of young people over the last couple of months, and I threw a challenge to them, which I throw a challenge to you. And that is, if the climate movement can come up with the climate justice equivalent of taking a knee, what taking a knee is to the issue of structural racism, we need to be also able to come up with ways we can communicate to people so that the hard fought actions that we execute are not portrayed and contaminated in a way that is that we never intended. So I would put to you that the biggest danger facing our collective effort and facing civil disobedience activities in particular is not the repressive state apparatus. It's not the army, the police, and the use of formal laws. I would argue it is more the ideological state apparatus, as Chris very eloquently pointed out. So it's the framework for education, the framework for religion, and most importantly, the framework for media. So civil disobedience has to understand that infrastructure as deeply as we can and strategically as we can if we are going to make a difference. The other point I would like to make is it's very important that those of us who are comfortable with engaging with civil disobedience do so with humility, with love, and with compassion. And we must do it with also respecting those that might not yet be ready to engage in civil disobedience. Because bear in mind, my experience in South Africa as a young activist is the person who joined and only did bake sales and raised money for certain protests. 3 to 5 years later, that's the person who's going to be in a frontline action. So it is really important that we understand why people might be hesitant to engage in civil disobedience. And I'm going to say something now that might be very unpopular. The challenge for us in the United States, for example, is whether we can develop the capability, the narrative, the communication tools, and the resistance activities that can win over the people that voted for Donald Trump. Just because they voted for a fascist, we must not write them out, right? We need to understand how they were manipulated so that they would actually arrive at that point, right? So it's critically important that we also, as your respect statement correctly said, that we value different people's efforts. Now, I want to note that the communications challenge around civil disobedience in the United States becomes somewhat complicated. Doesn't affect it in substance at all, but it challenges us to be very strategic in the light of the uncivil disobedience that we saw on January 6th, right? The act of insurrection and so on, because we have to think about how we play this, because in the minds of people on the receiving end, and you can be sure that the media infrastructure in the United States will very quickly try, once we build momentum, numbers, scale, and so on, they will try to portray it in that same veil. I want to conclude by just saying that in a context of COVID, I want to just endorse very strongly what Chris said, his critique of the current economic system, and just make this point, that I believe that the biggest disease that we are facing, which impacts on climate and every other injustice that we face, is a disease that is worse than COVID, and a disease that we could call affluenza, which is a pathological illness where people are led to believe that a good, meaningful, decent life comes from more and more and more and more material acquisition. Unless we can break that logic, which exists very well in civil society as well. It's not that those of us in civil society are immune from affluenza, right? But unless we can address the unequal consumption patterns within our countries, within our communities, and between rich and poor countries, we do not have a chance to actually deliver genuine climate justice. I want to conclude with the words of Martin Luther King when he said, speaking in 1965, he said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to." He goes on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination, and importantly on the economy," he says, "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. If that was relevant to the United States in 1965, it's 1,000 times more relevant today, not only to the United States, but to all of us around the world. If we do not address the unequal consumption, the broken economic system, and the capture of power by a very tiny elite in most of our countries, if we do not take on those big tasks with boldness and with civil disobedience playing a critical role, I don't think, given where things are now, we stand a chance for success. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kumi. So next, our next speaker is Roger Hallam, another co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and more recently Burning Pink, UK political party whose policy is to give the power to the people and create citizens' assemblies. And Roger has been a controversial figure at times, speaking truth not only to power, but also to so-called progressive or environmental groups too timid to disrupt business as usual. So Roger walks his talk, having been arrested many times and spent many dismal hours imprisoned for civil disobedience. So with that, take it away, Roger.
Yeah, well, I don't think I'm that controversial at all, actually. I think the people that don't want to go to prison are the controversial ones. That might sound controversial, but in the wider realm of history, I'm going to be the same one, and all the people sitting on this call going, maybe not, they're going to be the controversial ones, right? So let's change the frame around. I mean, I've been talking about the climate crisis and the necessity for civil resistance for 2 years. And I was thinking the other day how I'm going to do this sort of 7-8 minute talk. So the phrase that came to mind for me was, you can't be serious, right? You don't want to engage in civil disobedience. You can't be serious. And I don't know if you know that phrase, but it probably show my age, but I think John McEnroe said it on a tennis court about 30 years ago. And it's always stuck in the mind. You know, it's that total incredibility of, you just can't be serious, guys. You know, like, that's what I'm saying to you. And I'm going to say you can't be serious if you're not considering engaging in civil disobedience for 4 precise reasons. So the first thing is that this situation is beyond fucked, right? In the most visceral, absolute sense. It's completely off the scale. And if you're going to understand why it's off the scale, you need to know the numbers. When you go to the doctor and he tells you you've got cancer, you want to know the numbers. So let's do the numbers, because you're not going to be terrified unless you know the numbers, because it just sounds like rhetoric, doesn't it? We've got a great problem. The earth is in danger. We need to save the planet. What the hell does that mean? This is what it means. It means we're at 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial. In the last 10 years, the temperature went up by 0.3 of a degree. Do the maths. That means in the next 10 years, we're going over 1.6 degrees over pre-industrial. That means that Paris is a complete delusion. It always was a delusion. And it's going to become obvious to everyone around the world it was a delusion in the next 5 to 10 years, because it's locked in. 1.5 degrees is locked in. We're on the edge of the cliff and we're going over the cliff. It's not like we haven't arrived at the cliff. We're going over the cliff, right? Because we know that the Arctic is going to be melted in the summer by 2035. Peer-reviewed paper this year. That means we're going to add 0.4 of a degree to global warming. Global dimming, the pollution that's in the atmosphere, already means we've got locked in a 0.5 degree increase. Do the maths, right? We're going to be at 1.5 within 5 to 10 years, and we've got global dimming and the Arctic already absolutely factored in. That takes us to 2.5 degrees factored in. 2.5 degrees is the global average. The land average, you have to double or triple it. So in Africa, in the center of America, in Russia, in the landmass areas, it's going to be 6 degrees on an average day. On a hot day, it's going to be 15 degrees. Fact, when the temperature rises above 30 degrees centigrade, you can't grow crops, period. Okay? That means 2 things. The peer-reviewed papers say at 2 degrees centigrade, we're looking at 1,000 million people on the move. 1,000 million people on the move, right? That's 1 in 7 of the world's population. Half of Africa, most of Central America, India, Southeast Asia, right? The biggest fuck up in the history of humanity is already locked in, okay? And the second thing is mass starvation, because over 30 degrees centigrade, you can't grow crops. I'm a farmer, I'm telling you, you cannot grow crops at 2.5 degrees centigrade global average, which is 15 degrees above pre-industrial on a hot day. It's done. We're looking at mass starvation. That's the reality. And the other thing to really be absolutely terrified about is this goes on forever, right? It goes on forever. It's not like World War II, we get over it and pick ourselves up. We're on a slide down a cliff to hell, right? We're not looking at the next 7 generations here. We're looking at the next 10,000 generations, right? Like the previous speakers have said, in the next 10 years, we're going to be throwing away the livelihoods of the next fucking 10,000 generations of humanity. There is nothing in the 35 years of activism I've done that compares with the absolute horror, the absolute indescribable suffering of what we are dealing with at this point in history, period, right? Objectively, this is not rhetoric. I've given you the numbers. I could give 3 hours of numbers, but they're the killer numbers. So if you're telling me, if there's any of the 400 people on this call or there's thousands of people watching this video, and you're not saying this is the biggest crisis in human history, I'm saying you can't be serious. You can't be serious if you don't realize this is the absolute worst possibility. that humanity has ever had to deal with. The second point is about, why is this coming about? Is this a meteorite that's coming towards the Earth that's nothing we can do about? Absolutely not. For 30 years, the political class has had absolute concrete knowledge that this catastrophe is happening, right? They know, in full knowledge of the science, carbon emissions have gone up 60% in the last 30 years. The elites know it. The elites are guilty of the biggest crime in the history of humanity, period. Are you saying seriously, in 10 years' time, when these elites are on trial, they're not going to be found guilty? What I say to you is, you can't be serious. This catastrophe has been created by real people with real addresses who know precisely what is happening. David King, the head scientist in the Blair and Brown administration, said a fortnight ago that we have 4 years, 5 years to engage in massive investment in geoengineering, otherwise we're done for. In other words, he's accepting we've already fallen off the cliff. But is he going to engage in civil disobedience? Is he going to go into rebellion against the British government? Of course he's not, because he's a fucking coward, right? Like the rest of the political elites that me and Claire and other people on this call have had to deal with for the last 2 years. These people are psychopaths. They don't care. They're incapable of resistance. So if you're saying to me, well, Roger, this is just a natural disaster, you can't be serious, guys, right? So the third step is Biden is going to sort it out. You can't be serious. For 30 years, the conventional political parties dominated by the corporate elites have done absolutely nothing. Are you seriously saying the Biden administration is going to cut carbon emissions by 7.5% in absolute terms year on year for the next 4 years? You can't be serious, right? These people are dedicated to doing nothing that will undermine the short-term interests of the corporate elite. You've got 30 years of evidence. The reason why 200,000 people joined Extinction Rebellion in the UK in 12 months is because they lost faith in the elites. You can only lie to people so many times before they're going, you cannot be serious, right? So let's say clearly the Biden administration has zero intention to substantially bring us back from this dire situation. So that's the situation. We're dealing with the worst thing in history. We're dealing with the most criminal class in history, and the political elite has no intention to do anything about it. That means more than any other point in human history, resistance is now an absolute imperative. Anyone who's saying on this call that civil resistance is not an absolute imperative, then you can't be serious, guys, right? I've been involved in social movements for years and years, and sometimes there's good reasons and sometimes there's not. There are no good reasons for not engaging in civil disobedience at this point in history. You can't be serious if you're thinking that's the case. And I just want to finish by saying, what are you going to be doing in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, when a young person finds you're on this call, right? You know, when there's civil unrest, when there's social collapse, when there's mass starvation, and they said, you're on that call listening to Roger Hallam, and you didn't engage in civil disobedience. You can't be serious. You can't be serious. What? You heard the facts, you heard the guilt, you heard the zero intention for this to be changed, and you just carried on. You cannot be serious. You did that? Really? That's what's coming down the line, everybody, right? This generation is going to be the most ridiculed, hated generation in the history of humanity because we sat by and let this happen. as a leading London lawyer said to me last year, there is no greater crime, right? There is no greater crime than to stand by and allow this despicable crime, the biggest indescribable spasm of human suffering in humanity, to continue. That's my challenge to everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Roger, Kumi, Claire, and Chris. Thank you so much. I just have to say, if the words of these four incredible truth tellers don't make every single one of us here on this Zoom get up out of our seats and into the streets, I'm not sure what will. Anyway, my name is Faith, and I'll be helping to facilitate the rest of this session. And before we go to the Q&A, I just want to cover a few items. So it's been made very, very clear that everything, I'm talking about everything we love, is at stake right now. And the time for action together is right now. And as they say, if you're not terrified, you're not paying attention, right? We have a huge task in front of us. And when you join Extinction Rebellion America, you're aligning with some big and organized people in about 70 countries globally. A movement that's grown to be one of the biggest influencers in the world around this issue, with our spicy, naughty, rebellious civil disobedience actions, right? All wrapped up in big love, huge love for people and the planet. Actions that have brought business as usual to a standstill, but it's not enough. The game ain't over. Far from that. If we don't do something now, not tomorrow or next month or next year, but right fucking now, we'll be saying yes to the destruction of everything we love, right? So here's the hard truth. We can't grow a movement of organized, mindful rebellion without money. Sorry, it's just the hard truth. It's one of the ways that you come in, every single one of you here. Our goal is to become a people-funded movement, from some giving $3 a month to others pledging 25 or more a month. We just put a donate link in the chat. Please become part of our work by clicking that link and making a monthly pledge, okay? I mean, think about this. How many times each month do you go out and buy, without thinking, a $3 Starbucks coffee, or get a coffee at a cafe? Or how many times do you buy a $20 book at Amazon? So think about snatching that $20 out of Jeff Bezos's pocket and putting it to work with us, okay? So if you can, give 50 or 100, but if 20 is too much for you, give what you can. There is no minimum. It's our lifeblood, monthly pledges, so please be as generous as possible. And to give you time, let's take a little break, so everybody can go get a glass of water or a cup of coffee. It'll be just 2 minutes, and we'll be right back. So meanwhile, go ahead and make that donation and get yourself a glass of water. We'll be right back. All righty. Thank you so much. Everyone who's been able to help us out, your contribution moves us forward. And so thank you, thank you, thank you. There are two more quick action steps I want to go over before we go to the Q&A. Your next step is to click on the link in the chat to sign up for our Buckle Up Your Seatbelts, Heading for Extinction and XRA Orientation Talk. First one's coming up this Monday, March 1st, excuse me. You can take your pick. You can go to the 7 p.m. Pacific talk or the 7 p.m. Eastern talk. We offer it every Monday. So go ahead and register now by clicking one of those links. And if you've already attended the talk, no worries. Use those links to give to your friends and have them come. You know, it's called movement building. The last action step is also critically important. While our actions are often fun and edgy, right? Everybody knows about them. We do not take them lightly. Behind the fun, they are deeply serious and tightly integrated into our strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience. So click on the link we just placed in the chat to register for our next nonviolent civil disobedience training on Saturday. That's next Saturday, March 6th at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and 6 p.m. GMT. So, you know, nonviolent civil disobedience is the heart of our work, right? This training helps us embed that philosophy of nonviolence into our inner selves while preparing us for action in the streets. So click on that link, join us, and take the training. And then finally, just as an FYI, remember, we are going to stick around after the question and answer period for those of you who are ready to join the rebellion or simply want to learn more about interest skill areas you could help us with. We can talk about that. So let's get to the Q&A. Being mindful of our presenters' time, it looks like we have a hard stop in 30 minutes, bringing us to 12:30. So if you haven't already submitted your questions to XRA Questions in the chat, please do so now. And meanwhile, let's get started. And just for your information, I'll ask a question of each presenter before beginning the round again, and we'll go as they spoke first. So it'll be Chris, Claire, Kumi, and then Roger. So for Chris, let's see here. So Chris, we have a question here. What does America's civil rights history tell us about how we need to mobilize in XR?
That as Kumi said, it has to reach out to include people outside of your own group. The ability of the civil rights movement to be effective was because it incorporated a large number of white liberals and clergy into the movement. The real threat to the hegemony of the state came from all of those figures, the Black Panther leader Fred Hampton being a good example, who reached out to poor whites in Chicago. Hampton was assassinated after being drugged in his bed in Chicago by the FBI. So I have worked for a long time with Ralph Nader. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter, close to Ralph. And Ralph understood the primacy of organizing around an issue, organizing workers at Walmart. Well, there are communities when many workers at Walmart will be Trump supporters and will indeed say things that many of us find unpalatable. On the other hand, that's by building around a particular issue of injustice and organizing against that injustice, there is a process of commonality and common interest that allows us to break into these communities And it's tricky. I have, much of my family comes from rural Maine. They're lower working class. They embrace or opinions and language that I find distasteful. And yet they are also victims. And many of the people, certainly the people that I wrote about in these mega churches were victims. These mega pastors preyed on their despair in the same way that Trump preyed on the despair of people in his sham university or his casinos. Or, I mean, he had a business of doing this. But we aren't, I think Kumi made an important point that we're not going to build an effective movement. You know, with my own relatives, I didn't try and convert them. I told them that there was language that I didn't want to hear. I mean, if they wanted to speak that way amongst themselves, that was fine, but they couldn't speak that way in front of me. But I didn't cut them off. And I think that, I know Roger and I have spoken about this. I think it's extremely important because their children are going to be, their lives are going to be destroyed along with our children. I think in an age of cancel culture and sectarianism and identity politics, this becomes very self-destructive to those of us. I certainly come out of a progressive tradition, those of us in a progressive tradition. And I think that is, you know, absolutely key to going forward, that we, you know, we organize around issues. And that by organizing around those issues that affect all of us, we're going to be more powerful rather than trying to be kind of, you know, moral absolutists or thought police.
Thank you, Chris. So Claire, what would you say are your 3 biggest lessons from your work in XR that you would share to help us mobilize here in the US faster or more effectively?
Faster or more effectively? Well, I guess one of the things that I'm aware that Roger thinks is important, and I agree with him, is this idea of having good orators and having people who are going to travel and who are going to go around and connect people up and are going to talk and inspire people and encourage people. And I think understanding that as a need and understanding that as like a need that you need a lot of these people and in XR UK we've not got enough still, I don't think. So that would be one focus, one major focus. Another one is probably about participation and making spaces where people are participating well and understanding how to hold creative spaces well, which I think is something that we're wrestling with all the time. And what we've handed out in terms of our systems from XR UK are definitely, they're well designed for deliberation, and they're not that well designed if you're a designer, I can tell you, because design by consensus is not an ideal way to do creative work. So finding different ways of working with people where you've got good dynamics, where you've got good synergy, where there's something cool coming out of the work that you're doing together, and allowing yourselves to form creative groups really freely, that can make lots and lots of work. And I guess we made the design program in the UK as a gift, I guess, that could be given away. And it's the kind of antithesis, if you like, of a kind of branding gig. So it was designed intentionally to be a package that you can give away very quickly and everybody can use. And I think to some extent that's been really helpful, particularly having like a font to hang the work off. But anything that you can do to share creative so that you have a united voice, and also focusing on keeping the messaging fairly tight, because increasingly with a decentralized movement in the UK, I find that people sometimes are trying to put 50 words on a banner, and that's just not it as far as I'm concerned. You've got to work to like tight creative and support those people that are doing those roles. And I guess the other thing that I've learned, which I keep on trying to relearn, is to be able to manage yourself and your time so that you can go out and take experimental stuff forward, because it's very easy for systems to become bureaucratized by wanting to be fair, wanting to be inclusive, wanting to be you know, comes from a good place, but it can clog the system up. And so be really mindful of when you're letting groups get too big, and whether or not you yourself feel like you're still able to like tread some new ground. Because for me, I guess the appeal of working on this stuff always, from when I met Roger to, you know, now, is still just that I'm like learning so much, and I don't want to get stuck in a place where I feel like I can't do those experimental pieces of work that mean that I'm carrying on learning. So so in that way, kind of embedding a co-education culture, which I think we need to keep working on here in the UK a lot.
Well, that was a lot, Claire. A lot of really good ideas. So thank you for that, because we're struggling with these kinds of things here. So that was very insightful. Thank you. Kumi, here's a question. Practically, how can countries that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels for the economy transition at this late stage? JLo, I think Kumi is muted.
Thank you. So this is a big challenge, right, for us in the global south, because our leaders, both in the corporate and in the governmental sector, are saying things like, those folks in the north, they created the problem. They've destroyed the forests. They've used the fossil fuels. Now they're telling us we can't do it. And they've got sometimes very little options in terms of the economy. Now, why it's so important for us in Africa, for example, to have real resistance and progress on the climate agenda in the north, like in the US in particular, is it makes it easier for us to say to our governments, listen, you got to leave the coal in the oil, you got to leave the soil in the oil underground, you got to, even though it's painful, you might think, because the consequences of actually exploiting that is hitting us first. Because one of the terrible things about the climate struggle is that the people are paying the first and most brutal price are the ones that have actually contributed least to the problem, right? And so it's very hard. I believe there's no carbon space left, right? You know, because at one point in the UN negotiations, we were saying if there's carbon space, it should go for the countries. So basically, let's be very clear. Given what we know now, any 1 cent invested in a new fossil fuel project, right, is an investment in the death of our children and their children, right? And therefore, we have to put a hard stop. And I want to raise two issues, to, if I might, that reflect on the questions that came up earlier. You know, Chris, I was just thinking when you were speaking, as an outsider looking at the United States, whether there was some campaign we could learn from, you know, in the US about how you shift people from the left to the right, right to the left, or whatever, given how polarized things are in the US. And I was wondering that today, maybe rather than listening to somebody like me on this, you should go and look at the movement in the United States to legalize cannabis. I think there might be a lot to learn from that. Because today, if you look at the US, actually the number of people that want action on climate change and the number of people who want legalization of marijuana probably is almost in the same level. It's probably the same people, I guess, largely. But there's an opportunity now. I can tell you 5 years ago that it was a different story in terms of where US public opinion is. US public opinion has shifted, and there's an opportunity now for us to, but given and there are enough Republicans who feel strongly about climate change today than was before. I mean, all the opinion, because people are seeing extreme climate events impacting in their life. I'm sure just what happened in Texas has at least caused in a conservative state for people to start thinking. The other last point I wanted to make was, so I don't know the answer, but I just offer that, and by the way, what I do know is, I know the folks at ACLU have been driving and other places that have been doing work on this and the strategy of how you build coalitions that are untraditional coalitions. The last point I wanted to make is, and I just want to share this as a criticism that I've received many times in the United States when I've spoken, in a similar tone as Roger has, perhaps with a few less fucks in it, but largely the same tone. I remember speaking about 5 years ago to the environmental grant makers group, and to cut a long story short, at the end of the speech, somebody put up their hand and asked me, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" I said, "Yes, as a young person, he inspired me and many other people in my country." And then he said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" Thinking it was a trick question, I answered it very, very tentatively, saying, I have a dream. And she shouted back at me. She said, "Yes, it was I have a dream. But when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The forests are collapsing, the oceans are dissing, and so on." And she said to me, "How are you going to motivate people if you are just telling them it's over and so on?" So here's the challenge of leadership for all of us right now. We have to find the right balance between speaking truth to power on the one hand, not sanitizing how bad, how serious, how urgent the crisis is, but we are challenged at the same time to speak about it in a way that does not lead large numbers of people to feel a sense of it's too late, what's the point of participation, and so on. And it's a delicate balance. I know I've struggled with it for about 15 years, ever since I fully understood where the climate crisis was. So finding that right balance, I think, is a challenge for activism. And I don't know how we do it, because, and maybe this is what I would say, where the link between what we do and where things are at the moment. And this is something I've said on a couple of occasions, others have said it as well, which is the pessimism of our analysis, right, can only be overcome by the optimism of our actions, right? And in the sense that we have to create outlets. So for me, as somebody who engaged in civil disobedience when I was 15, when I got expelled from high school, civil disobedience is a natural thing. I'm committed to it. I see its value and so on. But I do urge us that we must be open to other complementary strategies that civil disobedience critically needs for it to be successful. The two that I would say, I was just pulling out two. One is what I call today the challenge of communications and artivism, right? So, and I know Extinction Rebellion has done some good stuff around trying to use art as a way of communication and so on, but we have to recognize the biggest challenge we have is a communications challenge, right? We have to get large numbers of people thinking and acting as we would like them to. We do not, I believe, succeed in that if we do not develop narratives, messages, and so on that speak to people's experience. Like, for example, I've been criticized many times, when I was head of Greenpeace, speaking at various things, people would say to me afterwards, especially where working class communities and all are involved, people say, "Kumi, we don't know what the hell you're talking about. Degrees, parts per million, COP, all of these things are just like outside of our experience." And so I just want to end with my biggest appeal. And I learned this as a young activist out of the Asia, from the resistance in Asia, where people said, go to the people, live with them, learn from them. Start with what they know, build on what they understand, so that when the struggle is won, people must say, we've done it ourselves. So let me just humbly say that the challenge of activism for us right now must also be one where we don't project our consciousness on the people that we are trying to organize without humbling ourselves, understanding where people are, and ensuring that our messages, our narratives, and so on, as Chris said, recognizes that the people that are not with us are also victims. They have been fed a pack of lies consistently by the most powerful and the people in the highest office and the most respectable so-called CEOs and so on. And we have to actually, if we're going to win, We have to believe that the justness of our cause is strong enough that we can win people who today, as we sit, are very far away from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumi. Roger, I have a question for you. Are you ready?
Yep.
We have somebody who's wondering what you think about legal action as a form of civil disobedience. In other words, can we sue companies to stop exploitation?
It's too late for anything other than civil resistance in 2021. That's the basic and unavoidable truth. Civil resistance usually involves a mass mobilization of 3 to 6 months that brings about structural change in the political regime. It's been done many times before, and it's the only game in town when you're facing a total emergency situation. 10 or 20 years ago, I would have said, fantastic, let's take companies to court. The only thing that rapidly changes things in an emergency is economic disruption of the society and economic disruption of the state. And that process starts off when a critical mass of people decide to go into civil resistance with no expectation of success. That's the main thing that I want to communicate, is you're sitting on this call, and I've sat on dozens of these calls where people are trying to bargain with what works and what doesn't work and what should happen and what shouldn't happen. At the end of the day, nothing substitutes economic disruption of the society, right? And once people enter into civil resistance, they, as we all know, get arrested, beaten up, put into prison. And there's nothing that avoids that path at this present moment in time, in my view. And through that process, then many other people will join the movement. This is not a cognitive strategy, right? We've had cognitive strategies for 30 years. You know, let's go out and talk to that group. Let's sue that group. Let's say this, let's say that. What drives radical political change is transgressive action and emotional outrage. Those are the two determinants. And as soon as it's possible, the people that need to be speaking on behalf of the movement, as other speakers have said, need to be working class people, people of color, people on the front line. Not just because they're on the front line, but because they can emote, right? No social movement in history gets anywhere without emotion. And this is the big disaster of the professional middle class appropriation of the climate cause over the last 30 years. No disrespect to the people here that are from that class, right? But you are not the leaders anymore. The people that need to be the leaders are the people that have been farm workers and manual workers, the people that know exactly what shit looks like because they've lived through 30 years of it. And that's why I swear, right? Because I've spent 30 years laboring on farms with people that swear in every sentence. And a lot of those people have more guts and more wisdom than the liberal North London elites, right? That I have to deal with on a regular basis, who are gutless and spineless because they've got too much skin in the game. So that's the strategy as I see it. You know, I'm talking directly to you on this call. This is not about some academic exercise of coming on this call to work out what should happen. There's been dozens and hundreds of those, right? For 30 years. The time now is to go, I will step up myself, because anything less than that is a complete transgression of my self-respect. That's the situation. So when we've got the mass movement, we can afford some time to strategize and all the rest of it. I spend 10 hours a day strategizing and creating tactics, right? I'm totally into all that stuff. I've done 5 years of systematic research at King's College on it. I could talk to you for hours about the pros and cons of legal strategies and different forms of civil disobedience, but those times have gone. We've already gone over the cliff, right? Other speakers say we're about to get over the cliff. We haven't. We've already gone over the fucking cliff, right? Get that into our heads. Billions of people are going to now suffer indescribable suffering because of the criminality of the global elites. In 2010, we hadn't gone over the cliff. We have today. And, you know, in reply to what Kumi is saying, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you have to be absolutely truthful and absolutely authentic. And that's how revolutions are created, by people that care nothing for being successful and everything for being decent and authentic and living who they are for the years they have left of their lives. That's it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Roger. We have time for one more question, and I'd like to give Chris a chance to answer this question. What do we do as the violence of decaying civilization ramps up in the coming years, Chris?
Well, I covered revolutions and uprisings around the globe as a foreign correspondent. And I saw how acts of conscience, which were ignored at the time and often dismissed as meaningless or impractical, in fact, radically changed the landscape. Václav Havel, I covered the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. And Václav Havel writes an essay called Living in Truth. Remember, resistance started with Charter 77 in 1977. So Havel was a non-person in communist Czechoslovakia. In 1968, when Dubček was overthrown by Soviet forces and a Soviet-backed Quisling government, there were heroic acts of resistance that were dismissed as impractical. Marta Kubasheva, who was the great Czech singer, probably the most popular singer in Czechoslovakia, wrote a song called Prayer for Marta that was broadcast over the airwaves in defiance of the crushing of the Prague Spring. Afterwards, she was banned from the airwaves. Her recording stock was destroyed. She became a non-person, quote unquote, in the eyes of the state, worked in the intervening years on an assembly line at a toy factory. 4 days after the overthrow of Dubček, a young Charles University student, Jan Palach, went to Wenceslas Square and lit himself on fire in protest and died of his burns. His funeral, which was not covered on state media, was broken up by the police. When his grave became a shrine, his remains were exhumed, and his ashes, he was cremated, given to his mother, and she was ordered not to rebury them. So I was in Prague in December of 1989. I was in Wenceslas Square when Marta Kubasheva walked out on that balcony in front of 500,000 Czechs who were protesting non-violently to bring down the communist dictatorship, and she began to sing a prayer for Marta. And every Czech in that crowd, most of whom were not born, were born after 1968, knew every word. I was there when 10,000 Czechs marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. That is the moral power of resistance, which Havel understood. That is what living in truth is. And I think that I come out of a faith tradition. And as the great radical priest, Daniel Berrigan, told me when I asked him to define faith, he said, it's the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if everything around us says otherwise. The good draws to it the good. Even if empirically it looks like everything is worse. But I can tell you, having been in those volatile moments of social upheaval and revolution, that the good does draw to it the good. That the death of the apartheid regime, despite the tremendous suffering on the part of anti-apartheid activists, many of whom were very young, who were killed in townships, and by standing unequivocally on the side of truth and being able to risk, and the anti-apartheid movement, certainly by the end, there was a violent component to it early on, but it was a nonviolent movement, and it exposes the dead hand of authority, the bankruptcy of a ruling elite. And so those tasked with defending that bankrupt elite will no longer defend it. And that is our power, and it's real. And it has the capacity for monumental change. I was in Leipzig in the fall of 1989. That was the epicenter of the protests in East Germany. Erich Honecker, who was the dictator of East Germany for 19 years, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd, and it never happened. They were never deployed in the streets. They never fired on the crowd, and Honecker was out of power within a week. And remember, the East German Stasi state was the most efficient police state until our own, until the one I live in now. So there is a power that we can harness, and it's not theoretical, and it's not overly optimistic, and it's not utopian, it's real. And we are at that crucial moment in human history where if we harness that power, we have a chance.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I want to thank all of our speakers. We're at 30 minutes. We're at the end of this part of our program. So Kumi, all the way in South Africa, I know it's late for you, so thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Claire, we love you. You're very dear to our hearts. Chris, I don't know what to say. We are so thankful that you are supportive of what we're trying to do, because you bring a strong voice for social justice in our midst. So thank you. And Roger, you know how we feel about you. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you all. If you'd like to stay with us, please do. But we understand that you have limited time. So if you would like to leave at this point, please feel free to do so. If you stay when we finish the second part, maybe we can open it up to more questions, but it's all up to you. The rest of you, please stay for the next part of our program. So if you want to know how to get involved with our rebellion, you're in the right place. We've carved out 5 interest and skill areas to help figure out how you could involve. They involve communications, organizing, movement vitality, infrastructure, and actions. So we're going to take 1 or 2 minutes to describe each one of them. Then we'll put a link in the chat that is a very short questionnaire so that you can indicate where you're interested in. And then when we call you back, we'll know what's going on. And then we'll take any questions that you might have. You can put them into the XRA questions chat again. So J-Lo, I can't see you, but are you there? Can you begin with the communications?
Yes, yes, I am. Can you hear me, Faith?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. And so after we do this little 5 pieces here very quickly, we will send you the link to the questionnaire, as Faith said, and then we'll hope for any of the speakers that stay beyond, because we have a lot of questions. If you have time, we'd love to get to those. So communications, of course, as has been said here on this call, communication is key. If we don't communicate better, and if we don't communicate wider, we're not going to engage as many people as we need to. So we have 4 areas that you can jump in and get in where you fit in and participate in the way that it's moving to you. The first is our website. Second is social media. Third is our messaging team. That's like press releases, video materials, putting out our newsletter, etc. And the fourth is our creatives. We need and love artistic people for all kinds of creativity. So those are the 4 areas. Inside of those, the website, of course, is number 1, content for the website, where we add pages when necessary, events, things like that. Also blogs. So we're looking for internal XR writers. We're looking for guest writers, and we're also looking for people to help us repurpose different pieces of content into blogs and other media. Second is social media, and that's really important. You know, we live in a social media world. So we're doing a couple of things with our social media. We are looking for content creation. That's our artistic friends, right? We're looking for content curation. That's to help us organize it and keep it straight. Then the next one is also verification, making sure that if we post a picture or a photo that we have the rights to do so. And then finally, on top of that, we also want to be able to do syndication and moderation. So we syndicate, meaning we get it out across all of our different XR websites and other platforms, and there's a lot of platforms out there. And then moderation, which is the ability to make sure that, you know, if someone from a fossil fuel company attacks us, that we kind of delete them or remove them because we've had some of those. So the next area is in messaging itself. This is number 3, messaging itself. In messaging, we have newsletters, press releases, official emails, official videos, articles that are written, media relations, and things like that. We need people who love to write. So if you love to write and or edit, please let us know. So on the link that you're going to get sent here in a few minutes, you'll be able to do that. Finally is creatives. I can't say enough about this. The first thing I noticed when I saw Extinction Rebellion in the UK and watched the videos with just like my eyes glued to the screen was how artistic and engaging it was, and how many people there were from all walks of life and all ages. And it was artistic. It was like a street fair with rebellion, and that was beautiful. And I think when we engage at that level, that creativeness is so necessary to what we're doing, and it helps the public engage with us better. So lots of creatives. So back to you, Faith. That's my, I guess, 90 seconds of communications. Check.
Thank you, J-Lo. That was a whole lot. So thank you. A lot for people to figure out where they can fit in. Jane, how about community organizing?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. It's obviously beyond critical that you're here with us. My name's Jane. I'm the internal coordinator of the Community Organizing Circle of Extinction Rebellion America. We have a great strategy in place for mobilization. It's a good plan to get involved. You can start your own chapter or your own affinity group with interests you're already involved in, or jump into an existing team for outreach or take on a role. We have lots of training opportunities and assistance from our amazing support community. So there's a lot of ways that you can help. The best place to start is by really just getting trained in our mission and all the steps to get there. So going to our Heading for Extinction presentation, J-Lo, Faith, and John do a fabulous job on Monday evenings. Take our nonviolent civil disobedience training coming up. We have a rebel pledge that we would ask you to sign. And Domio offers a action planning workshop and an action planning cafe, I think weekly. So there's a lot of different forms of support and ways we can help you expand your connections locally. And then we ask you to bring 2, 3, 4, 5 friends to the Heading for Extinction presentation. And that is how we are going to grow exponentially super fast. That's how we're going to do this. So please, please, please join us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jane. John, infrastructure and IT. Take it
Thank
away.
you. I'm John. I'm the internal coordinator of what we call infrastructure. All organizations need a sort of a basic structure to get things organized. And I'm responsible for 3 or 4 things I want to talk about. First, finance. Just keep track of the money, have people looking at participating in grants, helping plan our budget. We could use assistance in all of these fields. Second, legal. We need legal support, legal help, especially for people that are rebels that get arrested. We're organized all over the country, and we need assistance to provide support for people that are arrested, and also legal assistance just for day-to-day operational issues. You know, how do we create personnel policies for people that are working for us in a variety of states? Information technology, we have some computer systems we're using to help mobilize. We call that the Nation Builder system. We have organizational computer systems inside of our operations, how we keep track of emails, chats, discussions. We need people to help us support those operations. So if you have work experience and for some reason you don't want to get involved in or don't have the skills to get involved in artistic matters or actions on the street, we have some what you could call mundane day-to-day jobs that are absolutely critical. We're built on sacrificing, and sometimes sacrificing means doing difficult jobs to help the overall operation work. And finally, we just have issues of document management. How do we keep track of our records? And one of the things we try to do in Extinction Rebellion is provide resources for people out in the communities. How do we best prepare those resources and make them available through our website or in our record system so we can use assistance in all these matters? Thank you.
Great, John. Thank you so much. Domio, what about actions?
Yeah. For me, this is what it's all about. I mean, all the other stuff is necessary, right? It really is. And I'm involved in a lot of that as well. But we are really trying to support people in taking actions because you have to start somewhere, right? I mean, there's very few places in the US right now, or Canada and Mexico, North America, that have a critical mass of people to pull off some kind of big fancy action. But what we call these small actions is movement building actions. We need to get just, you know, Roger really emphasizes this, is just getting your body out there and getting used to being disruptive, right? Learning how to work together, even if you just stand and block traffic at a green light for one change of the light with a banner. It's a big deal to just start this. It's actually pretty nerve-wracking to go out there and do that. You don't jump usually right from doing nothing to, you know, locking yourself onto something and getting arrested. Yeah, so we want to encourage people to be starting these movement building actions, because this is not only does it demonstrate the severity of the crisis we're in, right? If somebody drives by and they see that you're doing something, or they see a video of it, they hear about it, and they see the kind of sacrifice or disruption that you're willing to put forth, they say, what is that about? Those people seem to really be concerned about something. What's that? So there's a certain impact on the public, but then there's also there's, you know, it was just so inspiring to listen to Chris and him talking about these acts of conscience. In a way, this is about, like, people, I know so many people who are in despair, and they're like, what can I do? And this is something we can do. And then, as Roger was saying, it's not about whether we think it's going to be successful. I mean, we give some thought, right, to strategy and how we go about it. But the most important thing is that we're getting out there and doing something. And the idea is then to build momentum, so that when the time comes and a trigger moment happens, when the moment of whirlwind happens, there are people who are ready. They know each other, they've been out there, they've done actions, and they're ready to show up at the state capitol. They're ready to go out in the streets. They're ready to do this kind of mass uprising. So we're trying to, sometimes it's baby steps at the beginning, but we really want to support that. So then we encourage people to attend the nonviolent civil disobedience training. But essentially, I mean, we are just so thrilled if any of you are even curious about doing an action. Just, you know, indicate that in this questionnaire. I will call you, someone will call you, even this afternoon, an hour after this meeting ends. We're going to have an action planning cafe. You'll see it listed on the xramerica website, where we're just, a couple of us are just making ourselves available. What are you thinking of doing? What, you know, and helping people plan stuff. And then we also have a monthly workshop on doing your first action. And the aim is, if you can plan to do something on March 27th, anything, even if it's just going sitting in a mall with a Rebellion of One sign on you or something, anything, see if you can get out on Saturday, March 27th, and get somebody to take a video and a picture and then we will put it on our website. So that is my pitch for actions.
Wow, if you don't want to jump into that, I don't know what's wrong with you. So, but you know, Jane, I'm wondering if you could put a link into the chat for the Action Planning Cafe that's coming up right after this. That would be great. That might help people who want to do that immediately. And then the last one that we want to just give you a summary about is our movement vitality work. And Michelle, can you come in on that?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle, and I'm a volunteer with Extinction Rebellion America. I'm here to talk about the Movement Vitality Circle, or what you may commonly hear as MVC. The Movement Vitality Circle was essentially birthed out of the idea that there was a component missing within the work that we were doing. The action work, super important, really needed to focus on that. Mobilization as well. Those were the two big pieces of our strategy. But the vitality piece, the community piece, the bonding, the connecting, that was the piece that we feel would make the difference between, you know, the success that other groups have seen and maybe a greater success, you know, as we bond and there's longevity and that kind of thing. Not very many other groups, organizations have that. Perhaps like you could look at churches, they're very much that way, and they're strong community-wise, they're effective in the works that they do. So we're gonna see how that goes. So in that, we have a lot of things we'd like to implement, so we can use a lot of help. If anybody's interested in kind of heart work and in kind of, you know, head work as far as just helping people through grief with, we have a grief sharing thing that we're trying to put into action. We'd like to get some conflict resolution kind of really banged in there. So lots of things that we can do to add to the community. So that is basically my pitch. I think that, and I think a lot of us feel that this piece is the piece that is going to really pivot us into a greater success. So please, if you have therapy or you're a teacher, you love kids, if you, whatever that is that you feel is a bonding community, definitely reach out to Faith. Are you the contact, or who? I'm going to stop, but thank you, everyone.
Yeah. What you need to do if you're interested in any of these things is fill out this less than a minute questionnaire. We're putting into a link into the chat right now. If Jane, if you would do that, go ahead and take it, and then we'll find out what it is you think you're interested in. So then make sure you include your phone number, and we will call you back and talk with you so we can get to know each other better and discover how best to shine a light on your skills and interests inside our movement to help build it. So I'll pause for just a second to let you fill out that questionnaire, and then take any questions. If you have any questions, additional questions about what we just presented, put them in the chat to XRA questions. And then I'm wondering, JLo, if you could read them once they come in. Okay, that's great. So we'll wait for just a second, maybe a minute here. And I just want to thank all of you for coming and staying on. This is great. We're really excited about growing our movement, and we do feel that we're on the cusp right now of sort of explosive growth. And we've worked very, very hard this past year in the time of COVID, right, where everything was shut down, which means the way we operate was severely impacted because we operate through people-to-people contact, right? So we had to strengthen our digital outreach and a whole lot of other ways of reaching out to people. And we strengthened our backbone. We have a lot of people working with us who we know have our backs as we have theirs, and they're with us through thick and thin. So you really want to join this community. because we're doing some really good things. So with that, I'm wondering if there are any questions, J-Lo. You're on mute, J-Lo.
Yep, there we go. Thank you. Yes, we have a question here. We still have a number of questions from the list. I'm looking for questions that relate to the different sections that we just spoke about, and I don't see any questions related to the 5 areas, the 5 circles. So maybe we should roll back to the remaining questions, especially since Claire is here, and let her.
Claire's still here. Oh, great.
Yep.
Oh, I'm so happy, Claire, because there were more questions for you. Are you ready to answer? Oh, she's muted.
There you go. Are you unmuted? There you go.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, Claire, so thank you so much for staying. Oh, this is wonderful.
That's
So
okay. I actually booked it out for like 2 hours. So I thought other people would stay. And then I was like, oh shit, they're all gone. Anyway, I can stay for like 10, 15 minutes. There's no problem.
Great, great. So let me see. Let me get you the next question here. What is the best way to get more youth and women into our mobilization? That was one of your questions.
Well, youth is a really good question, I think, because the youth movements are, you know, they looked strong at one point, and they've been celebrated for having this huge impact on everybody. But I really just also feel like a lot of youth activists I've met, not the people in XR Youth in the UK, but elsewhere, I find astonishingly liberal. And certainly teenagers that I've met in Europe who are, you know, in quotes, climate activists who are going around doing this work, they're very happy with a meeting with some UN people or some proper people, and they're quite hard to convince into the idea of doing disruption. And well, an interesting story for me, which I think would inspire young people, and I do think they potentially need some encouragement to push harder. One thing that I met Erica Chenoweth a while ago. She was doing a lecture here in London, and she said something very, very interesting to me about young people. And she said, you know, after Trump got elected, there were a lot of women who went into politics. Into local politics, and a lot of people apparently, commentating on that, saying, oh, you know, it's because Trump is such a disgusting chauvinist, it's because he's so sexist, it's because it's such a disgrace, it's because of the Women's March. And Erica said she thought actually it was about gun control, and it was about when the students walked out of schools over gun control. And because the impact of students that walk out en masse again and again and again prevent their teachers from working, they pull their parents out of work, and they take the entire of like the police force and all of civil society to take care of them, because the streets are full of vulnerable young people. And so she said this has a huge impact on people's communities. And I feel like children need inspiring, and young people need inspiring, to understand the power of their non-cooperation with the education system, which to me, striking once a month on a Friday is not enough. I would really encourage students to go further and to do mass walkouts again and again and again, because it's very peaceful, it's very, very disruptive for the adults. So that's one thing I think you could tell children to inspire them. They've got huge power, and I don't think they realize. What was the other one? Women.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know what to say about that really, because I think in the UK, at least, XR is majority women. And I guess actually, well, one thing that I think would be really helpful is that I think a lot of people, some time ago, I really wanted us to have a conversation in a public way about the invisible labor that women do. And a lot of feminists will know exactly what I'm talking about here. But it feels to me like it's so important that you have certain people doing certain roles, and sometimes you need people to do the thing that they're good at, right? So the most infuriating thing, my friend was out on the streets and he found somebody doing arrestee support, and he said, oh, what do you normally do? And she said, oh, I'm a lawyer. And he was like, what the fuck are you doing? Get in the legal team. And she was like, but I don't want to do that. So the first thing I think is people need to do what they're good at. And some people are really good at support. Some people are really good at care. Some people are really good at tending to people behind the scenes. And you do need, I know Roger's given it all the fucking big, you know, come on, but it does, if you're going to go out and do that work, you do need people behind you that aren't totally fried and like fucked because of what they've been through. You need people that support. And so in some ways, I think what we've not done well enough in the UK is to celebrate the people that do that work, because a lot of the focus, especially because the press are only really interested in the drama and the audacity of the actions. They love that. They love it when people are getting arrested. They love it even more if people get hurt and horrible things happen. They love it, love it, love it. Do they want to write a story about regenerative culture? No, they fucking don't. So we have to tell those stories ourselves, because otherwise those people that do that labor just don't get celebrated enough. They don't get lifted up enough. And so there is room as well for like the feminine in male work as well. And I've often found regen teams that are male dominant have been great in the past, some of them. So that's also not to say that all the labor is gendered at all, but just to make sure that all of the roles are celebrated. And I think women recognize that more than men do, whether or not you're really, really celebrating those people who, you know, maybe are carers, maybe they're disabled, maybe they work from home, maybe they can stay at home and they do the work from staying at home. Those people are so important. How do you visibilize them? How do you celebrate them? How do you show gratitude to them? It's a culture of gratitude that I wish we had more of in the UK in that way. And the media skews it towards the people with the super glue, unfortunately.
Yeah, how true is that? Yes. We have another question. Do you have time? You have 5 minutes left in your allotted time that you allotted to yourself. So hold on one second. How do we unite with other groups that have stood too long on the sidelines and bring this into a larger movement?
Great question. It is hard. Take a deep breath would be my advice. It's hard work. I mean, I think as you're all very well aware that you know, there are many difficulties with mobilizing across different groups that have different focus. I don't know if it's the same in America, but we've been heavily criticized in the UK for trying to universalize the issue, because people want to bring their work on maybe social justice with them, which says it's not universal. Everything's already very unjust. And so there are issues often around your approach or your tactics will be criticized as if they are part of an ideological apparatus which somebody can take issue with. And I guess to be very mindful of that phenomenon that happens, and try to always be able to approach people with like this humility to understand that people are frustrated, people have their own issues. It's very difficult to get people to come together. And I think one thing that I've been reading about movement ecology recently, and the idea of this like sort of fertile ground or soil from which things grow, often it has an ideological context, and then multiple movements can come and they can work together because they share these sort of core values. And that, to me, there isn't an ideological fertile ground in the UK for participatory democracy, because it doesn't say socialism, it doesn't say communism, it doesn't say anarchism, it doesn't say any of these things. It just says, let a bunch of ordinary people have a go at working out what's best. And that is our best last hope, really, in our opinion. And it's an experiment. And so it doesn't have a fertile ideological ground from which to grow out of. And I think that's been one of the challenges in the UK, and why we have our own peace group, our own animal group, our own everything group, because we do have a movement of movements, but it's largely born out of people who've come on board to the XR way or have grown it out of XR, rather than finding these neat relationships that we can build with other like-minded folks, because that it just feels too difficult. They're like, well, you won't say you're socialist, so I'm not your friend. And it's problematic because we keep saying, oh, come on, oh, go on, you know, we're not like anti-socialist, we're just open to other things too, and so we can't declare that, you know. And that makes it very challenging, because a lot of people, their political ideological beliefs are really embedded in their identity. They're really embedded in who they believe that they are, who they associate with, how they've lived their lives, especially if they've been politically active for a long time. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you might find some of the same struggles. And there's somebody who started Animal Rebellion in the UK here, called Dan, and he came to speak to us recently. And it was really, really helpful to hear this, because he went back to like original sort of principles of movement theory. And he went back to his friendship with Roger and Gail and his involvement in their early research. And Animal Rebellion, as probably similar in the States, the animal rights movements en masse, the environmental movements, bit frightened of them, really, because sometimes they do very radical things, right? And sometimes they do lots of different things, and sometimes there's people associated with that space who don't really want to go and say we're committed, say, to non-violence, or we're committed to certain ways that XR works. And what Dan did was like arrange it sounds very corporate and serious, but he arranged like a sort of memorandum of understanding with like different groups and different individuals to say, what can you leave at the door without sort of, you know, feeling that you've sacrificed too much of yourself, to come in and agree to work to these principles where you'll be accountable, you'll be non-violent, you'll be civil to the police, you'll be civil to the public, you'll be, you know, kind and polite to your oppressors. You know, can you agree to this, just so that we can do some collective action? And it doesn't mean that you don't get to have your own group and do your own stuff, but how can you make those agreements? And it's in the detail, really, in how you agree those things that you will and won't bring, and you will and won't let go of or take with you. But it takes friendship, I think, at this beginning, to be able to have the trust to be able to negotiate those things, because it's very, very sensitive work for a lot of people. And so the other thing I would say is, if you're trying to deal with other groups that don't agree with you, is kind of not to give up. Because sometimes you can go and speak to people and they go, no, you're all right, thanks, go away. And you go to a community that you don't know and they're like, yeah, all right, well, whatever you think, but like, I'm not doing that. And you go back and back and back and back, and you're, you know, consistently polite and kind, and have the humility to say, well, it's fine. If you don't want to, it's fine. And you might leave and scream when you get home and think, for fuck's sake, come on, what are you doing? But every time you go back, you have to like take that deep breath and say, are you ready yet? Would you talk to me again? Let's try again, you know? And that, I don't know if that's like the top tactic, but perhaps you could arrange to have a chat with some people in the Animal Rebellion team in the UK who might be able to talk more about their journey, or even invite Dan to come and chat to you. He'd be a super person to speak to.
Yes, thank you so much, Claire. Wow, we have to have more talks like this where you can share your experience, because we're kind of newbies here. I mean, a lot of us have been doing a whole lot of things throughout our lives, but the whole Extinction Rebellion approach is new for a lot of people. And what you just said about creating change with kindness, you know, always stepping over what the barriers are that you may feel and reaching out in kindness and in love. It's a real deal. It's a real thing. So, and it's very difficult at times. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we need to close this down now. We've gone 2 hours, and thank everybody who came and stayed on to the very end. I hope you've all done your questionnaires so we can get back with you. We need you. We need you with us. So we'll be talking with you, Claire. Much love. And thank you so much for all you're doing. And we're going to be talking again. Okay?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, love. And thank you, everyone. You're doing amazing. Get out on the streets.